What happens when Hollywood ego collides with real martial arts mastery? When Steven Seagal publicly humiliated Chuck Norris, calling him just a movie cowboy playing dress up, he thought his Aikido credentials would protect him. But some legends don't need to prove themselves until they're forced to. This is the story of pride, respect, and why the quietest warriors often hit the hardest. The year was 1995, and Hollywood's martial arts elite had gathered at a private dojo in Beverly Hills for what was supposed to be a friendly demonstration event. The who's who of action cinema filled the room: Jackie Chan, Jean-Claude Van Damme, and dozens of stunt coordinators and fight choreographers. But all eyes were on two men who couldn't have been more different. In one corner stood Steven Seagal, draped in his signature black, radiating the kind of confidence that bordered on arrogance. His Aikido demonstrations had made him a household name, and his recent string of box office hits had inflated his ego to dangerous proportions. Seagal moved through the crowd like he owned the place, accepting praise and admiration as his birthright. Across the room, Chuck Norris sat quietly on a bench, methodically wrapping his hands. At 55, the Texas Ranger star had nothing left to prove to anyone. His 6 world karate championships spoke louder than words ever could. While others networked and postured, Chuck simply prepared, the way a true martial artist always does. The contrast was striking. Where Seagal commanded attention, Chuck commanded respect. Where Seagal spoke loudly about his achievements, Chuck let his legendary tournament record speak for itself. But sometimes the loudest voice in the room doesn't belong to the strongest person. The demonstration had been proceeding smoothly until someone suggested that Chuck show off some of his famous techniques. The crowd murmured with excitement. Seeing a living legend in action was a rare treat. Chuck politely declined, as he always did. He wasn't there to show off. He was there to learn from the younger generation. But Steven Seagal saw weakness where others saw humility. "What's wrong, Chuck?" Seagal's voice cut through the dojo like a blade. The room fell silent. "Afraid to show everyone that you're just a movie cowboy playing dress up?" The words hung in the air like poison. Chuck's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he remained seated. Those who knew him recognized the warning signs. The slight straightening of his shoulders, the way his breathing became controlled and deliberate. Seagal wasn't finished. Emboldened by what he mistook for fear, he continued his verbal assault. "I mean, we all know the difference between real martial arts and Hollywood choreography, right?" He gestured dramatically. "Some of us have dedicated our lives to authentic combat techniques. Others just learned how to throw fake punches for the cameras." The insult wasn't just personal. It was professional suicide. Chuck Norris hadn't just acted in martial arts movies. He dominated competitive karate when it was still underground and brutal. He'd trained with legends and created legends, but more importantly, he'd never used his reputation as a weapon against others. Chuck finally stood up, his movements fluid and purposeful. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried the weight of absolute authority. "Steven, I think there might be a misunderstanding here." But Seagal was too intoxicated by his own performance to recognize the danger. "Oh, there's no misunderstanding, cowboy. I'm just saying that some of us walk the walk, while others just talk the talk." He turned to the crowd with a theatrical smile. "How about we settle this like real martial artists? Unless, of course, you're too old for actual combat." The challenge was issued. In front of Hollywood's martial arts community, Steven Seagal had just called out Chuck Norris. The room buzzed with nervous energy. Everyone knew Chuck's reputation, but Seagal was younger, bigger, and seemingly more aggressive. What they didn't understand was that Chuck had spent decades learning when to fight and when to walk away. But sometimes walking away isn't an option, especially when respect for the art itself is on the line. Chuck nodded slowly. "If you think a demonstration would be educational, I'm happy to oblige." His tone was still respectful, still measured, but something had changed in his eyes. The quiet storm was about to break. As the crowd formed a circle, Chuck's mind briefly wandered to his early days in Korea, training in dingy dojangs where respect was earned through blood and sweat. He remembered his first tournament victory, his 6th world championship, the countless hours perfecting techniques that were never meant for show. Chuck had learned long ago that true martial arts weren't about domination. They were about discipline, respect, and the wisdom to know when to use your skills. He'd built a career on being the good guy, the hero who fought only when necessary. But he'd also learned that sometimes the only way to teach respect is to demonstrate why it should never be taken lightly. Steven Seagal, meanwhile, was reveling in the attention. He'd made a career out of being invincible on screen, and he genuinely believed his own hype. His aikido was real, his technique was solid, but his understanding of combat was limited to controlled environments and compliant partners. As they faced each other in the center of the circle, the difference became clear. Seagal postured and positioned, making a show of his preparations. Chuck simply centered himself, finding that quiet place where technique meets instinct. "Last chance to back down, cowboy," Seagal taunted, settling into his fighting stance. Chuck's response was almost too quiet to hear. "I never back down from defending what I respect." What happened next lasted less than 30 seconds, but it would be talked about in martial arts circles for decades. Seagal moved first, attempting to grab Chuck's wrist in a classic Aikido control technique. It was textbook perfect, except Chuck wasn't a textbook opponent. As Seagal's hand closed on air, Chuck had already shifted, his body moving with the fluid precision of someone who'd spent 40 years perfecting the art of combat. The first exchange was almost educational. Chuck deflected Seagal's attacks with minimal effort, demonstrating the difference between movie martial arts and tournament-tested technique. But Seagal's ego wouldn't let him recognize what was happening. He pressed harder, became more aggressive, and made the fatal mistake of trying to overpower someone who'd mastered the art of using an opponent's strength against them. Chuck's counterattack was poetry in motion, a perfect combination that showcased 4 decades of championship-level karate: a feint, a redirection, and a strike that stopped just short of Seagal's jaw. But the message was clear: this could have ended very differently. Seagal found himself on the ground, looking up at a man who just demonstrated the difference between having a black belt and being a black belt. The room was silent except for the sound of Seagal's labored breathing and the gentle rustle of Chuck's GI as he stepped back. Chuck extended his hand to help Seagal up. It was a gesture that spoke volumes about character. Even in victory, he chose respect over humiliation. "Good match," and he said simply, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But Seagal's pride was wounded deeper than his body. He ignored the offered hand and scrambled to his feet, his face flushed with embarrassment and rage. "This isn't over," he muttered, but the words carried no weight. Everyone in the room had seen what needed to be seen. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Chuck gathered his things with the same quiet dignity he'd maintained throughout the encounter. Several younger martial artists approached him, eyes wide with awe and respect. He spoke with each of them, offering encouragement and wisdom, treating them as equals rather than subordinates. Someone asked him how it felt to put Seagal in his place. Chuck's response was characteristically thoughtful. "I didn't put anyone anywhere. I just reminded everyone, including myself, why we study these arts in the first place." The story of that day became legend, but not for the reasons you might expect. It wasn't remembered as a victory of one man over another, but as a demonstration of what true martial arts mastery looks like. Chucknorris had shown that real strength doesn't need to announce itself, that true confidence doesn't require putting others down, and that the most dangerous opponents are often the quietest ones. Steven Seagal learned a hard lesson about the difference between Hollywood tough and real tough. More importantly, everyone else learned something about character. They witnessed what happens when ego meets experience, when bluster encounters wisdom, when someone who talks the talk meets someone who's been walking the walk for decades. The moral of this story isn't about winning or losing. It's about respect. Respect for the art, respect for others, and most importantly, respect for yourself. Chucknorris didn't need to humiliate Steven Seagal to prove his point. He simply needed to remind everyone in that room that true warriors don't seek fights, but when forced to fight, they do so with purpose, precision, and ultimately, mercy. In a world full of loud voices and empty boasts, remember this: the most powerful people are often the quietest, and the strongest warriors are usually the ones with nothing left to prove. Because when you've already conquered yourself, conquering others becomes unnecessary. Sometimes the roundhouse kick is silent, but it always finds its target.